that's based on power and compulsion.
El nivel 4 es ya
is much more
todo
I
abierto
would say with
y
the,
con resurrección.
Western
Y todavía con
Western
zombies.
societies. There's really a qualitative difference. And it's not some morally relativistic illusion.
So, if you just look at the nuance of Nietzsche's thought, the idea he first introduced in Thus Spoke Zarathustra of the Übermensch.
Yeah?
That's another one that's very easy to misinterpret because it sounds awfully a lot like it's about power.
Yeah, right.
For example, in the 20th century, it was misrepresented and co-opted by Hitler to advocate for the extermination of the inferior non-Aryan races.
Yeah, and the dominion of the superior Aryans. Yeah, and that was partly because Nietzsche's work also was misrepresented by his
siquiera tan engañadas.
But definitely. But I also think that there's a fundamental flaw in that Nietzschean conceptualization. So Nietzsche, of course, famously announced the death of God, but he did that in a manner that was accompanied by dire warnings, like Nietzsche said, because people tend to think of that as a triumphalist statement, but Nietzsche actually said that, he really said something like the unifying ethos under which we've organized ourselves psychologically and socially has now been fatally undermined by the rationalist proclivity, by the empiricist proclivity. There's a variety of reasons. Mostly it was conflict between the Enlightenment view, let's say, and the classic religious view, and that there will be dire consequences for that. And Nietzsche knew, like Dostoevsky knew, that, see, there's a proclivity for the human psyche and for human societies to move towards something approximating a unity, because the cost of disunity is high. Fractionation of your goals, so that means you're less motivated to move forward than you might be because there's many things competing for your attention. And also anxiety, because anxiety actually signals something like goal conflict. So there's an inescapable proclivity of value systems to unite. Now, if you kill the thing that's uniting them, that's the death of God, they either fractionate and you get confusion, anxiety, and hopelessness, or you get social disunity, or something else arises out of the abyss to constitute that unifying force. And Nietzsche said specifically that he believed that one of those manifestations would be that of communism, and that would kill, he said this in Will to Power, that would kill tens of millions of people in the upcoming 20th century. He could see that coming 50 years earlier. Dostoevsky did the same thing in his book Demons. So this is the thing that the a-religious have to contend with. It's a real conundrum because, I mean, you could dispute the idea that our value systems tend towards a unity, and society does as well, because otherwise we're disunified. But the cost of that disunity, as I said, is goal confusion, anxiety, and hopelessness. So it's like a real cost. So you could dispense with the notion of unity altogether, and the postmodernists did that to some degree. But they pulled off a sleight of hand too, where they replaced it by power. Now Nietzsche he's responsible for that to some degree, because Nietzsche said, with his conception of the Overman, let's say, is that human beings would have to create their own values, because the value structure that had descended from on high was now shunted aside. But there's a major problem with that. Many major problems. The psychoanalysts were the first people who really figured this out after Nietzsche, because imagine that we don't have a relationship with the transcendental anymore that orients us. Okay, now we have to turn to ourselves. Okay, now if we were a unity, clear unity, within ourselves, let's say, then we can turn to ourselves for that discovery. But if we're a fractionated plurality internally, then when we turn to ourselves, we turn to a fractionated plurality. Well, that was Freud's observation. It's like, well, how can you make your own values when you're not the master in your own house? Like you're a war of competing motivations. Or maybe you're someone who's dominated by the will to force and compulsion. And so why do you think that you can rely on yourself as the source of values? And why do you think you're wise enough to consult with yourself to find out what those values are or what they should be, say, in the course of a single life? I mean, you know, it's difficult to organize your own personal relationship, like one relationship in the course of your life, let alone to try to imagine that out of whole cloth you could construct an ethos that would be psychologically and socially stabilizing and last over the long run. It's like, and of course Marx, people like that, the people who reduce human motivation to a single axis, they had the intellectual hubris to imagine that they could do that. Postmodernists are a good example of that as well.
Okay, but if we lay on the table religion, communism, Nazism, they are all unifying ethos. They're unifying ideas, but they're also horribly dividing ideas. They both unify and divide. Religion has also divided people.
Yeah.
Because in the nuances of how the different peoples wrestle with God, they have come to different conclusions, and then they use those conclusions, or perhaps the people in power use those conclusions to then start wars, to start hatred, to divide.
Yeah, well, it's one of the key sub-themes in the Gospels is the sub-theme of the Pharisees. And so the fundamental enemies of Christ in the Gospels are the Pharisees and the scribes and the lawyers. So what does that mean? The Pharisees are religious hypocrites. The scribes are academics who worship their own intellect. And the lawyers are the legal minds who use the law as a weapon. And so they're the enemy of the Redeemer. That's a subplot in the Gospel stories. And that actually all means something. The Pharisaic problem is that the best of all possible ideas can be used by the worst actors in the worst possible way. And maybe this is an existential conundrum, is that the most evil people use the best possible ideas to the worst possible ends. And then you have the conundrum of how do you separate out, let's say, the genuine religious people from those who use the religious enterprise only for their own machinations. We're seeing this happen online. Like, one of the things that you're seeing happening online, I'm sure you've noticed this, especially on the right-wing psychopathic troll side of the distribution, is the weaponization of a certain form of Christian ideation. And that's often marked, at least online, by the presence of, what would you say, cliches like Christ is King, which has a certain religious meaning, but a completely different meaning in this sphere of emerging right-wing pathology. Right-wing political dimension is the right dimension of analysis. But it's definitely the case that the best possible ideas can be used for the worst possible purposes. And that also brings up another specter, which is like, well, is there any reliable and valid way of distinguishing truly beneficial unifying ideas from those that are pathological? And so that's another thing that I tried to detail out in these lectures, but also in this new book. It's like, how do you tell the good actors from the bad actors at the most fundamental level of analysis?
And good ideas from the bad ideas, and you lecture on truth that Nietzsche also struggled with. So how do you know that communism is a bad idea versus it's a good idea implemented by bad actors?
Right. That's a more subtle variant of the religious problem, and that's what the communists say all the time. The modern day communists, like, real communism has never been tried. And you could say, I suppose, with some justification, you could say that real Christianity has never been tried because we always fall short of the ideal mark. And so, I mean, my rejoinder to the communists is something like, every single time it's been implemented, wherever it's been implemented, regardless of the culture and the background of the people who've implemented it, it's had exactly the same catastrophic consequences. It's like, I don't know how many examples you need of that, but I believe we've generated sufficient examples so that that case is basically resolved. Now, the general rejoinder to that is, it's really something like, well, if I was in charge of the communist enterprise, the utopia would have come about. Right, but that's also a form of dangerous pretense. Part of the way, see, that problem is actually resolved to some degree in the developing notion of sacrifice that emerges in the Western canon over thousands and thousands of years. So one of the suggestions, for example, and this is something exemplified in the Passion story, is that you can tell the valid holder of an idea because that holder will take the responsibility for the consequences of his idea onto himself. And that's why, for example, you see one way of conceptualizing Christ in the gospel story is as the ultimate sacrifice to God. So you might ask, well, what's the ultimate sacrifice? There are variants of the answer to that. One form of ultimate sacrifice is the sacrifice of a child, the offering of a child, and the other is the offering of the self. And the story of Christ brings both of those together, because he's the Son of God that's offered to God. And so it's an archetypal resolution of that tension between ultimate sacrifice. Ultimate because once you're a parent, most parents would rather sacrifice themselves than their children, right? So you have something that becomes of even more value than yourself. But the sacrifice of self is also a very high order level of sacrifice. Christ is an archetype of the pattern of being that's predicated on the decision to offer everything up to the highest value, right? That pattern of self-sacrifice. And I think part of the reason that's valid is because the person who undertakes to do that pays the price themselves. It's not externalized. They're not trying to change anyone else, except maybe by example. It's your problem. Like Solzhenitsyn pointed that out too, when he was struggling with the idea of good versus evil. And you see this in more sophisticated literature. You know, in really unsophisticated literature, it's around. There's a good guy and the bad guy. And the good guy's all good, and the bad guy's all bad. And in more sophisticated literature, the good and bad are abstracted. You could think of them as spirits, and then those spirits possess all the characters in the complex drama to a greater or lesser degree, and that battle is fought out both socially and internally. In the high order religious conceptualization in the West, if they culminate, let's say, in the Christian story, the notion is that battle between good and evil is fundamentally played out as an internal drama.
Yeah, so for a religious ethos, the battle between good and evil is fought within each individual human heart.
Right, it's your moral duty to constrain evil within yourself. And well, there's more to it than that, because there's also the insistence that if you do that, that makes you the most effective possible, like warrior, let's say, against evil itself in the social world. That you start with the battle that occurs within you, in the soul, let's say. The soul becomes the battleground between the forces of good and evil. The idea that there's an idea there too, which is if that battle is undertaken successfully, then it doesn't have to be played out in the social world as actual conflict. Right? You can rectify the conflict internally without it having to be played out as fate, as Jung put it.
So what would you say to Nietzsche, who called Christianity the slave morality? And his critique of religion in that way was slave morality versus master morality, and then you put in Ubermensch into that.
See, I would say that the woke phenomenon is the manifestation of the slave morality that Nietzsche criticized, and that there are elements of Christianity that can be gerrymandered to support that mode of perception and conception. But I think he was wrong in his essential criticism of Christianity in that regard. Now, it's complicated with Nietzsche because Nietzsche never criticizes the gospel stories directly. What he basically criticizes is something like the pathologies of institutionalized religion. And I would say most particularly of the, of the sort of casually too nice Protestant form. You know, that's a thumbnail sketch and perhaps somewhat unfair, but given the alignment, let's say, of the more mainstream Protestant movements with the woke mob, I don't think it's an absurd criticism. It's something like the degeneration of Christianity into the notion that good and harmless are the same thing, or good and empathic are the same thing, which is simply not true, and far too simplified. And I also think Nietzsche was extremely wrong in his presumption that human beings should take it to themselves to construct their own values. I think he made a colossal error in that presumption.
And that is the idea of the Ubermensch, that the great individual, the best of us, should create our own values.
Well, and I think the reason that he was wrong about that is that, so when God gives instructions to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, he basically tells them that they can do anything they want in the walled garden. So that's the kind of balance between order and nature that makes up the human environment. Human beings have the freedom, vouchsafed to them by God, to do anything they want in the garden, except to mess with the most fundamental rules. So God says to people, you're not to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which fundamentally means there is an implicit moral order and you're to abide by it. Your freedom stops at the foundation. And you can think about that. I'd be interested even in your ideas about this as an engineer, let's say, is that there is an ethos that's implicit in being itself. And your ethos has to be a reflection of that. And that isn't under your control. You can't gerrymander the foundation because your foundational beliefs have to put you in harmony, like musical harmony, with the actual structure of reality as such. So I can give you an example of that. So our goal, insofar as we're conducting ourselves properly, is to have the kind of interesting conversation that allows both of us to express ourselves in a manner that enables us to learn and grow, such that we can share that with everyone who's listening. And if our aim is true and upward, then that's what we're doing. Well, that means that we're going to have to match ourselves to a pattern of interaction, and that's marked for us emotionally. Like you and I both know this. If we're doing this right, we're going to be interested in the conversation. We're not going to be looking at our watch. We're not going to be thinking about what we're aiming at. We're just going to communicate. Now, the religious interpretation of that would be that we were doing something like making the redemptive logos manifest between us in dialogue. And that's something that can be shared. To do that, we have to align with that pattern. I can't decide that there's some arbitrary way that I'm going to play you. I mean, I could do that if I was a psychopathic manipulator, but to do that optimally, I'm not going to impose a certain mode of, a certain a priori aim, let's say, on our communication and manipulate you into that. So the constraints on my ethos reflect the actual structure of the world. And I can't, this is the communist presumption. It's like we're going to burn everything down and we're going to start from scratch. We've got these axiomatic presumptions. We're going to put them into place and we're going to socialize people so they now think and live like communists from day one. And human beings are infinitely malleable. And we can use a rational set of presuppositions to decide what sort of beings they should be. The transhumanists are doing this too. It's like, no, there's a pattern of being that you have to fall into alignment with. And I think it's the pattern of being, by the way, that if you fall into alignment with, it gives you hope, it protects you from anxiety, and it gives you a sense of harmony with your surroundings and with other people. And none of that's arbitrary.
But don't you think we both arrived to this conversation with rigid axioms that we have, maybe we're blind to them, but in the same way that the Marxists came with very rigid axioms about the way the world is and the way it should be? Aren't we coming to that?
Well, we definitely come to the conversation with a hierarchy of foundational axioms. Right? And I would say the more sophisticated you are as a thinker, the deeper the level at which you're willing to play. So imagine first that you have presumptions of different depth. There's more predicated on the more fundamental axioms. And then that there's a space of play around them. And that space of play is going to depend on the sophistication of the player, obviously. But those who are capable of engaging in deeper conversations talk about more fundamental things with more play. Now, we have to come to the conversation with a certain degree of structure because we wouldn't be able to understand each other or communicate if a lot of things were already assumed or taken for granted.
How rigid is the hierarchy of axioms that religion provides? This is what I'm trying to understand. The rigidity of that hierarchy.
Rigid as play.
Well, play is not rigid at all.
No. It's got a rigidity.
There's some constraint.
It took me about 40 years to figure out the answer to that question. So it wasn't, I'm serious about that. So it wasn't a random answer. So play is very rigid in some ways. So like if you and I go out to play basketball or chess, like there are rules and you can't break the rules because then you're no longer in the game. But then there's a dynamism within those rules that's, well, with chess, it's virtually infinite. I mean, I think, what is it, there's more patterns of potential games on a chessboard than there are subatomic particles in the observable universe. Like, it's an insane space. So it's not like there's not freedom within it. But it's a weird paradox in a way, isn't it? Because music is like this too, is that there are definitely rules. And there are things, you can't throw a basketball into a chess or it would still be playing chess. But weirdly enough, if you adhere to the rules, the realm of freedom increases rather than decreases. And I think you can make the same case for a playful conversation. It's like we're playing by certain rules and a lot of them are implicit. But that doesn't mean that, it might mean the reverse of constraint, because in this seminar, for example, that I was referring to, the Exodus seminar and then the Gospel seminar, everybody in the seminar, there's about 8 of us, played fair. Nobody used power. Nobody tried to prove they were right. They put forward their points, but they were like, here's a way of looking at that. Assess it. And they were also doing it genuinely. It's like, this is what I've concluded about, say, this story. And I'm going to make a case for it, but I'd like to hear what you have to say, because maybe you can change it, you can extend it, you can find a flaw in it. And that's a conversation that has flow and that's engaging and that other people will listen to as well. And that's also, I think that one of the things that we can conclude now, and we can do this even from a neuroscientific basis, is that sense of engaged meaning is a marker not only for the emergence of harmony between you and your environment, but for the emergence of that harmony in a way that is developmentally rich, that moves you upward towards, what would you say? I think towards a more effective entropic state. That's actually the technical answer to that. But it makes you more than you are. And there's a directionality in that.
Well, I would like to the reason I like talking about communism, because it has clearly been shown as a set of ideas to be destructive to humanity. But I would like to understand from an engineering perspective the characteristics of communism versus religion, where you could identify religious thought is going to lead to a better human being, a better society, and communist Marxist thought is not. Because there's ambiguity, there's room for play in communism and Marxism, because they kind of had a utopian sense of where everybody's headed. Don't know how it's going to happen. Maybe revolution is required, but after the revolution is done, we'll figure it out. And there's an underlying assumption that maybe human beings are good and they'll figure it out once you remove the oppressor.
Yeah.
I mean, all these ideas kind of, until you put them into practice, they can be quite convincing.
Very.
In the 19th century, if I was reading, which is kind of fascinating, the 19th century produced such powerful ideas. Marx, Nietzsche.
Oh, fascism too, for that matter.
Fascism. Mm-hmm. So, if I was sitting there, especially if I'm feeling shitty about myself, a lot of these ideas are pretty powerful as a way to plug the nihilist hole.
Yeah, right, absolutely. Well, and some of them may actually have an appropriate scope of application. It could be that some of the foundational axioms of communism, socialism / communism, are actually functional in a sufficiently small social group, maybe a tribal group even. Like I also have I'm not sure this is correct, but I have a suspicion that the pervasive attractiveness of some of the radical left ideas that we're talking about are pervasive precisely because they are functional within, say, families, but also within the small tribal groups that people might have originally evolved into, and that once we become civilized, so we produce societies that are united, even among people who don't know one another, different principles have to apply as a consequence of scale. So that's partly an engineering response, but I think there's a deeper way of going after the communist problem. So I think part of the fundamental problem with the communist axioms is the notion that the world of complex social interactions can be simplified sufficiently so that centralized planning authorities can deal with it. And I think the best way to think about the free exchange rejoinder to that presumption is, no, the sum total of human interactions in a large civilization are so immense that you need a distributed network of cognition in order to compute the proper way forward. And so what you do is you give each actor their domain of individual choice so that they can maximize their own movement forward, and you allow the aggregate direction to emerge from that rather than trying to impose it from the top down, which I think is computationally impossible. So that might be one engineering reason why the communist solution doesn't work. Like I read in Solzhenitsyn, for example, that the Central Soviet authorities often had to make 200 pricing decisions a day. Now, if you've ever started a business or created a product and had to wrestle with the problem of pricing, you become aware of just how intractable that is. Like, how do you calculate worth? Well, there's the central existential problem of life. How do you calculate worth? It's not something like a central authority can sit down and just manage. And there is a lot of inputs that go into a pricing decision, and the free market answer to that is something like, well, if you get the price right, people will buy it and you'll survive.
This is a fascinating way to describe how ideas fail. So communism perhaps fails because just like when people believe the earth is flat, when you look outside, it looks flat, but you can't see beyond the horizon, I guess. So
yeah, right.
In the same way with communism seems like a great idea in my family and my people I love, but it doesn't scale.
And it doesn't iterate. And that's a form of scaling too.
Right. Well, I mean, whatever ways it breaks down, it doesn't scale.
Yeah.
And you're saying religious thought is a thing that might scale.
I would say religious thought is the record of those ideas that have in fact scaled. Right.
And
right.
Iterated. Well,
and iterated.
Does religious thought iterate? So I mean, there's a fundamental conservative aspect to religious thought.
Yeah.
Tradition.
Yeah. This is why, like Mircea Eliade, for example, who I referred to earlier, one of the things Eliade did, and very effectively, and people like Joseph Campbell, who in some ways were popularizers of Eliade's ideas and Carl Jung, what they really did was devote themselves to an analysis of those ideas that scaled and iterated across the largest possible spans of time. And so Eliade and Jung, Erich Neumann, they were looking, and Campbell, they were looking at patterns of narrative that were common across religious traditions that had spanned millennia, and found many patterns. The hero's myth, for example, is one of those patterns. And it's, I think, the evidence that it has its reflection in human neurophysiology and neuropsychology is incontrovertible. And so these foundational narratives, they last. They're common across multiple religious traditions. They unite, they work psychologically, but they also reflect the underlying neurophysiological architecture. So I can give you an example of that. So the hero myth is really a quest myth, and a quest myth is really a story of exploration and expansion of adaptation. Right, so Bilbo is a hobbit. He's kind of an ordinary everyman. He lives in a very constrained and orderly and secure world, and then the quest call comes and he goes out and he expands his personality and develops his wisdom. And that's reflected in human neuropsychological architecture at a very low level, way below cognition. So one of the most fundamental elements of the mammalian brain, and even in lower animal forms, is the hypothalamus. It's sort of the root of primary motivation. So it governs lust, and it regulates your breathing, and it regulates your hunger, and it regulates your thirst, and it regulates your temperature. Like really low-level biological necessities are regulated by the hypothalamus. When you get hungry, it's the hypothalamus. When you're activated in a defensively aggressive manner, that's the hypothalamus. Half the hypothalamus is the origin of the dopaminergic tracts, and they subsume exploration. And so you could think of the human motivational reality as a domain that's governed by axiomatic motivational states, love, sex, defensive aggression, hunger, and another domain that's governed by exploration. And the rule would be something like, when your basic motivational states are sated, explore. Well then, and that's not cognitive. Like I said, this is deep, deep brain architecture. It's extraordinarily ancient. And the exploration story is something like, go out into the unknown and take the risks, because the information that you discover and the skills you develop will be worthwhile even in sating the basic motivation of drive. And then you want to learn to do that in a iterative manner, so it sustains across time, and you want to do it in a way that unites you with other people. And there's a pattern to that, and I do think that's the pattern that we strive to encapsulate in our deep religious narrative, and I think that in many ways we've done that successfully.
What is the belief in God? How does that fit in? What does it mean to believe in God?
Okay, so in one of the stories that I cover in We who wrestle with God, which I've only recently begun to take apart, say in the last 2 years, is the story of Abraham. And it's a very cool story. And it's also related, by the way, to your question about what makes communism wrong. And Dostoevsky knew this, not precisely the Abraham story, but the same reason. In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky made a very telling observation. So he speaks in the voice of a cynical, nihilistic, and bitter bureaucrat who's been a failure, who's talking cynically about the nature of human beings, but also very accurately. And one of the things he points out with regards to modern utopianism is that human beings are very strange creatures, and that if you gave them what the socialist utopians want to give them, so let's say all your needs are taken care of, all your material needs are taken care of, and even indefinitely. Dostoevsky's claim was, you don't understand human beings very well, because if you put them in an environment that was that comfortable, they would purposefully go insane just to break it into bits, just so something interesting would happen. Right, and he says it's the human proclivity to curse and complain. And he says this in quite a cynic and caustic manner, but he's pointing to something deep, which is that we're not built for comfort and security. We're not infants. We're not after satiation. So then you might ask, well, what the hell are we after then? That's what the Abraham story addresses. And Abraham is the first true individual in the biblical narrative. So you can think about his story as the archetypal story of the developing individual. So you said, well, what's God? Well, in the Abraham story, God is characterized a lot of different ways in classic religious texts. Like the Bible is actually a compilation of different characterizations of the divine, with the insistence that they reflect an underlying unity. In the story of Abraham, the divine is the call to adventure. So Abraham has the socialist utopia at hand. He's from a wealthy family, and he has everything he needs. And he actually doesn't do anything until he's in his 70s. Now, hypothetically, people in those times lived much longer. But a voice comes to Abraham, and it tells him something very specific. It says, leave your zone of comfort. Leave your parents, leave your tent, leave your community, leave your tribe, leave your land. Go out into the world. And Abraham thinks, well, why? I've got naked slave girls peeling grapes and feeding them to me. It's like, what do I need an adventure for? And God tells him, this is the covenant, by the way. Part of the covenant that the God of the Israelites makes with his people. It's very, very specific. It's very brilliant. He says, if you follow the voice of adventure, you'll become a blessing to yourself. So that's a good deal, because people generally live at odds with themselves. And he says, God says, that's not all. You'll become a blessing to yourself in a way that furthers your reputation among people and validly, so that you'll accomplish things that were real and people will know it, and you'll be held high in their esteem, and that will be valid. So that's a pretty good deal, because social people would like to be regarded as of utility and worth by others, and so that's a good deal. And God says that's not all. You'll establish something of lasting, permanent, and deep value. And that's why Abraham becomes the father of nations. And finally, he caps it off, and he says there's a better element even to it. There's a capstone. You'll do all three of those things in a way that's maximally beneficial to everyone else. And so the divinity in the Abrahamic story is making a claim. He says, first of all, there's a drive that you should attend to. So the spirit of adventure that calls you out of your zone of comfort. Now, if you attend to that and you make the sacrifices necessary to follow that path, then the following benefits will accrue to you. Your life will be a blessing. Everyone will hold you in high esteem. You'll establish something of permanent value, and you'll do it in a way that's maximally beneficial to everyone else. And so we'll think about what this means biologically or from an engineering standpoint. It means that the instinct to develop that characterizes outward moving children, let's say, or adults, is the same instinct that allows for psychological stability, that allows for movement upward in the social hierarchy, that establishes something iterable, and that does that in a manner that allows everyone else to partake in the same process. Well, that's a good deal. And I can't see how it cannot be true, because the alternative hypothesis would be that the spirit that moves you beyond yourself to develop, the spirit of a curious child, let's say, what is that antithetical to your own esteem? Is that antithetical to other people's best interest? Is it not the thing that increases the probability that you will do something permanent? That's a stupid theory.
So God is a call to adventure with some constraints.
A call to true adventure.
To true adventure.
True adventure. Yeah, and then that's a good observation, because that begs the question. What constitutes the most true adventure? Well, that's not fully fleshed out until, at least from the Christian perspective, that's not fully fleshed out until the Gospels. Because the passion of Christ is you could say, this is the perfectly reasonable way of looking at it, the passion of Christ is the truest adventure of Abraham. That's a terrible thing, because the passion story is a catastrophic tragedy, although it obviously has its redemptive elements. But one of the things that's implied there is that there's no distinction between the true adventure of life and taking on the pathway of maximal responsibility and burden. And I can't see how that cannot be true. Because the counter hypothesis is, well, Lex, the best thing for you to do in your life is to shrink from all challenge and hide, right? To remain infantile, to remain secure, not to ever push yourself beyond your limits, not to take any risks. Well, no one thinks that's true.
So basically, the maximally worthwhile adventure could possibly be highly correlated with the hardest possible available adventure.
The hardest possible available adventure voluntarily undertaken.
Does it have to be
voluntary? It has
voluntary?
to be absolutely.
How do you define voluntarily?
Well, here's an example of that. That's a good question too. When Christ is the night before the crucifixion, which in principle he knows is coming, he asks God to relieve him of his burden, and understandably so. I mean, that's the scene famously in which he's literally sweating blood, because he knows what's coming. And the Romans designed crucifixion to be the most agonizing and humiliating possible. Agonizing, humiliating, and disgusting possible death. Right, so there was every reason to be apprehensive about that. And you might say, well, could you undertake that voluntarily as an adventure? And the answer to that is something like, well, what's your relationship with death? Like, that's a problem you have to solve. And you could fight it, and you could be bitter about it, and there's reasons for that, especially if it's painful and degrading. But the alternative is something like, well, that's what's fleshed out in religious imagery always. It's very difficult to cast into words. It's like, no, you welcome the struggle. That's why I called the book We Who Wrestle with God. You welcome the struggle. And Lex, I don't see how you can come to terms with life without construing it as something like, bring it on, welcome the struggle. And I can't see that there's a limit to this. Like, well, I welcome the struggle until it gets difficult.
So there's not a bell curve, like the struggle in moderation. Basically, you have to welcome whatever as hard as it gets. And the crucifixion in that way is a symbol
of that. Well, it's worse than that in some ways, because the crucifixion exemplifies the worst possible death. But that isn't the only element of the struggle, because mythologically, classically, after Christ's death, he heralds hell. And what that means, as far as I can tell, psychologically, is that you're not only required, let's say, to take on the full existential burden of life and to welcome it, regardless of what it is, and to maintain your upward aim despite all temptations to the contrary, but you also have to confront the root of malevolence itself. So it's not merely tragedy, and I think the malevolence is actually worse. And the reason I think that is because I know the literature on post-traumatic stress disorder, and most people who encounter, let's say, a challenge that's so brutal that it fragments them, it isn't mere suffering that does that to people. It's an encounter with malevolence that does that to people. Their own, sometimes, often, by the way. Soldier will go out into a battlefield and find out that there's a part of him that really enjoys the mayhem. And that conceptualization doesn't fit in well with everything he thinks he knows about himself and humanity. And after that contact with that dark part of himself, he never recovers. That happens to people. And it happens to people who encounter bad actors in the world, too. If you're a naive person and the right narcissistic psychopath comes your way, you are in like mortal trouble because you might die, but that's not where the trouble ends.
If there's a young man in their 20s listening to this, how do they escape the pull of Dostoevsky's Notes Money? With the eyes open to the world, how do they select the adventure?
So there's other characterizations of the divine, say in the Old Testament stories. So one pattern of characterization that I think is really relevant to that question is the conception of God as calling and conscience. Okay, so what does it mean? It's a description of the manner in which your destiny announces itself to you. And I'm using that terminology, and it's distinguishable, say, from Nietzsche's notion that you create your own values. It's like, part of the way you can tell that that's wrong is that you can't voluntarily gerrymander your own interests, right? Like, you find some things interesting, and that seems natural and autonomous, and other things you don't find interesting, and you can't really force yourself to be interested in. Now, so what is the domain of interest that makes itself manifest to you? Well, it's like an autonomous spirit. It's like certain things in your field of perception are illuminated to you. Think, oh, that's interesting, that's compelling, that's gripping. Rudolf Otto, who studied the phenomenology of religious experience, described that as Newman's thing grips you because you're compelled by it, and maybe it's also somewhat anxiety provoking. It's the same reaction that like a cat has to a dog when the cat's hair stands on end. That's an awe response. And so there's going to be things in your phenomenological field that pull you forward, compel you. That's like the voice of positive emotion and enthusiasm. Things draw you into the world. Might be love, might be aesthetic interest, it might be friendship, it might be social status, it might be duty and industriousness. Like, there's various domains of interest that shine for people. That's sort of on the positive side. God is calling, right? That would be akin to the spirit of adventure for Abraham. But there's also God is conscience, and this is a useful thing to know too. Certain things bother you. They take root within you, and they turn your thoughts towards certain issues. Like, there are things you're interested in that you've pursued your whole life. There are things I'm interested in that I felt as a moral compulsion. And so you could think, and I think the way you can think about it technically is that something pulls you forward so that you move ahead and you develop. And then another voice, this is the voice of negative emotion, says, while you're moving forward, stay on this narrow pathway, right? And it'll mark deviations, and it marks deviations with shame and guilt and anxiety, regret. And that actually has a voice. Don't do that. Well, why not? Well, you're wandering off the straight and narrow path. So the divine marks the pathway forward and reveals it, but then puts up the constraints of conscience. And the divine in the Old Testament is portrayed not least as that dynamic between calling and conscience.
What do you do with the negative emotions? You didn't mention envy. There's some really dark ones that can really put you into some bad places. Envy, fear.
Yeah, envy's a really bad one. Pride and envy are among the worst. Those are the sins of Cain, by the way, in the story of Cain and Abel. Because Cain fails, because his sacrifices are insufficient. He doesn't offer his best. And so he's rejected, and that makes him bitter and unhappy. And he goes to complain to God, and God says two things. He said, if God tells him if your sacrifices were appropriate, you'd be accepted. It's a brutal thing. It's a brutal rejoinder. And he also says, you can't blame your misery on your failure. You could learn from your failure. When you failed, you invited in the spirit of envy and resentment, and you allowed it to possess you, and that's why you're miserable. And so Cain is embittered by that response, and that's when he kills Abel. And so you might say, well, how do you fortify yourself against that pathway of resentment? And part of the classic religious practice is aimed to do that precisely. What's the antithesis of envy? Gratitude. That's something you can practice, right? And I mean literally practice.
I think envy is one of the biggest enemies for a young person, because basically you're starting from nowhere. Life is hard. You've achieved nothing. And you're striving and you're failing constantly because
And you see other people who you think aren't having the same problem.
Yeah, and they succeed. And they could be your neighbor, they could be succeeding by a little bit, or somebody on the internet succeeding by a lot. And I think that can really pull a person down. That kind of envy can really destroy a person.
Yeah, definitely. Well, the gratitude element would be something like, well, yeah, you don't know anything, and you're at the bottom, but you're not 80. You know, one of the best predictors of wealth in the United States is age. So then you might say, well, who's got it better? The old rich guy or the young poor guy? And I would say most old rich guys would trade their wealth for youth. So it's not exactly clear at all at any stage who's got the upper hand, who's got the advantage. And you know, you could say, well, I've got all these burdens in front of me because I'm young and oh my God. Or you could say, every dragon has its treasure. And that's actually a pattern of perception. You know, I'm not saying that people don't have their challenges. They certainly do. But discriminating between a challenge and an opportunity is very, very difficult. And learning to see a challenge as an opportunity, that's the beginning of wisdom.
It's interesting. I don't know how it works. Maybe you can elucidate. But when you have envy towards somebody, if you just celebrate them, so gratitude, but actually, as opposed to sort of ignoring and being grateful for the things you have, like you really celebrate that person, it transforms. It lights the way. I don't know why that is exactly.
The only reason you're envious is because you see someone who has something that you want. Okay, so let's think about it. Well, first of all, the fact that they have it means that in principle you could get it. At least someone has. So that's a pretty good deal. And then you might say, well, the fact that I'm envious of that person means that I actually want something. And then you might think, well, what am I envious of? I'm envious of their attractiveness to women. It's like, okay, well, now you know something about yourself. You know that one true motivation that's making itself manifest to you is that you wish that you would be the sort of person who is attractive to women. Now, of course, that's an extremely common longing among men, period, but particularly among young men. It's like, well, what makes you so sure you couldn't have that? Well, how about, here's an answer. You don't have enough faith in yourself. And maybe you don't have enough faith in, well, I would say the divine. You don't believe that the world is characterized by enough potentiality so that even miserable you has a crack at the brass ring. And like I talked about this actually practically in one of my previous books, because I wrote a chapter called Compare Yourself to Who You Are and Not to Someone Else at Present. Well, why? Well, your best benchmark for tomorrow is you today. And you might not be able to have what someone else has on the particular axis you're comparing yourself with them on, but you could make an incremental improvement over your current state, regardless of the direction that you're aiming. And it is the case, and this is a law, the return on incremental improvement is exponential or geometric and not linear. So even if you start, this is why the hero is always born in a lonely place, mythologically. Right? Christ, who redeems the world, is born in a manger with the animals to poverty-stricken parents in the middle of a God-forsaken desert, in a nondescript time and place, isolated. Well, why? Well, because everyone young struggles with their insufficiency. But that doesn't mean that great things can't make themselves manifest. And part of the insistence in the biblical text, for example, is that it's incumbent on you to have the courage, to have faith in yourself and in the spirit of reality, the essence of reality, regardless of how you construe the evidence at hand. Right. Look at me. I'm so useless. I don't know anything. I don't have anything. It's hopeless. I don't have it within me. The world couldn't offer me that possibility. Well, what the hell do you know about that? This is what Job thinks about suffering in the book of Job. And Job is tortured terribly by God, who makes a bet with Satan himself to bring him down. And Job's decision in the face of his intense suffering is, I'm not going to lose faith in the essential goodness, and I'm not going to lose faith in the essential goodness of being itself, regardless of how terrible the face it's showing to me at the moment happens to be. And I think, okay, what do you make of that claim? Well, let's look at it practically. You're being tortured by the arbitrariness of life. That's horrible. Now you lose faith in yourself, and you become cynical about being. So, are you infinitely worse off instantly? And then you might say, well, yeah, but it's really asking a lot of people that they maintain faith even in their darkest hours. But yeah, that might be asking everything from people. But then you also might ask, this is a very strange question. If you were brought into being by something that was essentially good, wouldn't that thing that brought you into being demand that you make the best of yourself manifest? And wouldn't it be precisely when you most need that it would be that you'd be desperate enough to risk what it would take to let it emerge?
So you kind of make it seem that reason could be the thing that takes you out of a place of darkness, sort of finding that calling through reason. I think it's also possible when reason fails you to just take the leap. Navigate not by reason, but by finding the thing that scares you, the risk, to take the risk, take the leap, and then figure it out while you're in the air.
Yeah, well, I think that's always part of a heroic adventure. You know, is that ability to cut the Gordian knot. But you could also ask from an engineering perspective, okay, what are the axioms that make a decision like that possible? And the answer would be something like, I'm going to make the presumption that if I move forward in good faith, whatever happens to me will be the best thing that could possibly happen, no matter what it is. And I think that's actually how you make an alliance with truth. And I also think that truth is an adventure. And the way you make an alliance with truth is by assuming that whatever happens to you, if you're living in truth, is the best thing that could happen, even if you can't see that at any given moment. Because otherwise you'd say that truth would be just a handmaiden of advantage. Well, I'm going to say something truthful, and I pay a price. Well, that means I shouldn't have said it. Well, that possibly, but that's not the only possible standard of evaluation. Because what you're doing is you're making the outcome your deity, right? Well, I just reverse that and say, no, truth is the deity. The outcome is variable, but that doesn't eradicate the initial axiom. Right?
It may be when you said Abraham was being fed by naked ladies.
That's an interpolation, obviously, but would have been out of keeping with the times.
But it does make me think, sort of in stark contrast to Nietzsche's own life, that perhaps getting laid early on in life is a huge starter. Step one, get laid, and then go for adventure. There's some basic, like you mentioned, satiation.
So I think it's perfectly reasonable to bring the sexual element in because it's a powerful motivating force that has to be integrated. I don't think it's adventure, it's romantic adventure.
Right. But the lack of basic interaction, sexual interaction, I feel like is the engine that drives towards that cynicism of the incel.
It is,
in
but
Dostoevsky's
both. There's very little doubt about that. We know perfectly well anthropologically that the most unstable social situation you can generate is young men with no access to women. That's not good. And they'll do anything to reverse that situation. So that's very dangerous. But then I would also say there's every suggestion that the pathway of adventure itself is the best pathway to romantic attractiveness. And we know this in some ways in a very blunt manner. The Google boys, the engineers, were too, what would you say, naively oriented towards empirical truth to note when they're being politically incorrect. They wrote a great book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts, which I really like. It's a very good book, and it's engineers as psychologists. And so they'll say all sorts of things that no one with any sense would ever say that happen to be true. And they studied the pattern of pornographic fantasy, and women like pornographic stories, not images. So women's use of pornography is literal. Who are the main protagonists in female pornographic fantasy? Pirates. All those vampires, surgeons, billionaires. Tony Stark. You know?
Yeah.
And so the basic pornographic narrative is Beauty and the Beast. Goes like terrible, aggressive male, tameable by the right relationship, hot erotic. And so I would say to the young men who, and I have many times, to the young men who are lost in isolation, first of all, join the bloody club. Because the default value of a 15-year-old male is zero. And there's reason for that. You know, and zero is a bit of an exaggeration, but not much. And the reason for that is, well, what the hell do you know? Like, you're not good for anything. You have potential, and maybe plenty. And hopefully that'll be made manifest. But you shouldn't be all upset because you're the same loser as everyone else your age has always been since the beginning of time. But then you might ask, well, what should I do about it? The answer is, get yourself together. You know, stand up straight with your shoulders back. Take on some adventure. Find your calling. Abide by your conscience. Put yourself together. And you'll become attractive. We know this is true. The correlation between male sexual opportunity and relative masculine status is about 0.6. That's higher than the correlation between intelligence and academic achievement. I don't think that there's a larger correlation between two independent phenomena in the entire social science and health literature than the correlation between relative male social status and reproductive success. Men are motivated to attain social status because it confers upon them reproductive success, and that's not only cognitively but biologically. I'll give you an example of this. There's a documentary I watch from time to time, which I think is the most brilliant documentary I've ever seen. It's called Crumb, and it's the story of this underground cartoonist, Robert Crumb, who was in high school, was in the category of males, for whom a date was not only not likely, but unimaginable. So he was at the bottom of the bottom rung, and almost all the reactions he got from females wasn't just no, it was like, are you out of your mind? Like, with that contempt, right? And then he became successful. So the documentary is super interesting because it tracks the utter pathology of sexual fantasies because he was bitter and resentful. And if you want to understand the psychology of serial sexual killers and the like, and you watch Crumb, you'll find out a lot more about that than anybody with any sense would want to know. But then he makes this transition, partly because he does take the heroic adventure, and he actually has a family and children, and he's actually a pretty functional person, as opposed to his brothers, one of whom commits suicide, and one of whom is literally a repeat sexual offender. It's a brutal documentary. But what he did in his adolescence, after being rejected, was he found what he was interested in. He was a very good artist. He was very interested in music. And he started to pursue those sort of single-mindedly, and he became successful. And as soon as he became successful, and the documentary tracks this beautifully, he's immediately attracted to women. And then you might ask, too, even if you're cynical, why do I have to perform for women? And the answer to that is something like, why the hell should they have anything to do with you if you're useless? They're going to have infants. They don't need another one. Right? Partly the reason that women are hypergamous, but they want males who are of higher status than they are, is because they're trying to redress the reproductive burden. And it's substantial. I mean, the female of any species is the sex that devotes more to the reproductive function. That's a more fundamental definition than chromosomal differentiation. And that's taken to its